Not really a nope story, but I'll go ahead and tell it anyway, 'cause to this day, it makes me wonder. I was around 9 or 10 years old. I didn't really have any friends. I lived in a neighborhood filled with mostly old people. One day, a family moved in next door. Now that I think about it, I never really saw the parents. They had a boy my age named Michael, and I became best friends with him. He was pretty cool. He'd draw these awesome dragons in comics. We always played in the forest. He never came over, and constantly made excuses as to why he couldn't. I never went over to his house either. Said his parents wouldn't allow it. It was pretty weird, but I didn't question it at that age. I was friends with Michael for around 6 months. But one day, he just kind of vanished. I paid it no mind and went along with my life. Fast forward 8 or 9 years, I was talking about memories with my mom as I was leaving for college in a few days. I brought up something about Michael, and it took her a moment for her to remember who I was talking about. "Oh, your imaginary friend?" Now that I think about it, those were some pretty weird times. You mentioned something about a family moving in next door, but that house still remains empty to this day. I remember when you would go off to wherever with him, and you always came back acting strangely. I thought that was pretty weird. I changed the topic and eventually had to leave to go do stuff. It's been 3 years since then, and I still feel odd thinking about it. The times I had with him seemed too real, and I'm not convinced that he was an imaginary friend. Plus, I'm not the type to have had one. When I think back, though, it seems really weird that when Michael disappeared, I didn't even question it, nor did I miss him at all. He was a close bud. However, I have to admit that I have no evidence that he was a real person. It feels weird, man. As a kid, I would always try to sleep with the light on, because when the light was off, I would see a man standing in my hallway, watching me while I was trying to fall asleep. Needless to say, at 5 it freaked me out, and more often than not I would end up in bed with my parents because I was too scared to sleep alone. For years I would see him there, and my parents said nothing to me about the former owner of the house. Turns out the guy had a heart attack and died in my room. He had a daughter that was about my age at the time it happened. My parents didn't want to scare me by telling me, but I was more worried about the complete stranger watching me all the time. My memory of this is just like watching a movie. I can't remember specific details of things like the sheets, but the general layout of the room is clear. I make that point because I was 4, nearly 36 now, and it was one of the most, if not the most, traumatic experience I've ever had. My mother's boyfriend was out of town on a business trip. We were living in a small house near a lake, but nowhere close to the marina. My mother came in to put me to sleep. She closed and locked my window, which was higher up on the wall than I could reach at the time. She kissed me goodnight and turned off the light. It wasn't even 10 minutes before my window opened, and the most god-awful, monstrous scream was coming from the window. I screamed out. My mother was already on her way in. She asked me what was wrong and noticed that the window was open. "Did you open the window?" she asked, knowing good and well that I wasn't physically capable of it. "No, Mommy," I replied between cries. She shut the window, locked it again, told me everything was okay, and retucked me in. She started to walk out of the room when the window flew open again, and the same monstrous roar was heard. We didn't spend another night in that house until her boyfriend got back in town, and I vaguely remember moving shortly after that. Sure, I was 4, but that's always been a vivid memory. I wish I could plug someone into my head Matrix style, so that they could see and hear what I saw. Interestingly enough, a group of friends and I ended up hearing a similar noise in 7th or 8th grade while we were playing in some woods near one of our houses. I don't think I've ever run as fast as we did as we scrambled to get out of those woods. I remember a room in our basement that wasn't there. I never gave any of this any thought until I was older and looked back on it. To be honest, it's kind of terrifying, and I'm glad that our family doesn't own the house anymore, and that my memories are very limited in detail. I would sit on this brown couch in the room and just stare at this small portion of wall that had a large closet behind it. It was only the small 3-foot section, and I remember the feeling in my gut that I would get when sitting on the couch. But for whatever reason, I would go down there, and I remember that I did it semi-rebelliously, in that I wasn't forbidden, but I would only do it when I was home alone, or parents were outside, or I was being babysat. The only real memory was the time I heard a loud crash upstairs. My parents were cleaning for a party, and I escaped down there. The picture of the deer on the wall fell, and I ran up the stairs, and I remember the smell of the vacuum cleaner. Weird, I know. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me was when I was in daycare. I was playing on the playground when, suddenly, everything went black for a moment. Not like when you shut your eyes black, but like there was literally nothing. Just like the entire world rebooted. It lasted maybe 1 second max, or felt like just a second of total nothingness. The weirdest part is that I remember another kid on the playground asking the daycare teacher what happened. Something along the lines of, "What was that darkness?" I remember he was as confused as I was. When I was 8 years old, I was over at my grandma's house. She told me not to snoop around in a certain room because it was under renovations. I didn't understand what she meant, but said okay. I went to the room anyway because I was a terribly curious child and disobedient. I put my ear to the door and heard pure silence. Next, I looked through the keyhole. It was dark in there, even though there was a window in every room and the curtains were all lacy grandma stuff. I heard a rustling, and for a split second, I saw an eye looking back at me. I screamed like a banshee and ran back to Grandma. She scolded me for disobeying, but comforted me and told me to stay with her big dog. She went upstairs, and I heard her yelling at someone. "Get out! You don't live here anymore! Stop this instant!" I never really understood, but I feel really weirded out when I think about it. I asked my grandma about it last year. She first frowned, then smiled as if I was saying something weird, and then just changed the subject. When I was 6 or 7 years old, I was in my bed and really tired at around 6 p.m., which was unusual. I had a giant stuffed German Shepherd I won at Six Flags, Butterscotch. The hallway light was somewhat illuminating my room, and I could make out roughly the silhouette of Butterscotch right next to me. My eyes were closed and I was half asleep, when suddenly I heard some kind of scraping noise. I looked over and saw what roughly looked like the outline of a giant beetle crawling on my bed. And then, I swear, Butterscotch started growling. The stuffed animal began to growl. The room was filled with buzzing and growling noises. I had no idea what was going on. I began to cry and burst out of the bed. I ran all the way downstairs and babbled to my family about what happened. I still don't know what was going on that night. I always had an overactive imagination, but on absolutely no day since then have I ever had such a lucid hallucination or anything of the sort. I was around 8 years old and living on a farm. My dad used to make Bale Mazes for me and my siblings to play in. One night, we were playing tag in the maze. I was hiding in a dark corner, away from anyone else, when a large hand, obviously belonging to an adult, reached through the gap between two bales across from me. The hand silently gestured towards me, beckoning me over. I freaked out and ran back to the house. Me being a stupid kid, I didn't tell anyone else about it. Over the years, I became convinced it was just a dream. Until one night, a couple years ago, I was camping with my brother and some friends, telling spooky stories around the campfire. My brother said he had a creepy childhood memory, and then told an almost identical story. When I was about 6 or 7, my older sisters used to collect porcelain dolls. They always creeped me out, especially since Child's Play came out around that time and they forced me to watch it. I remember they were both staying at the neighbor's one night. I didn't have a TV in my room, but theirs had one. I went downstairs to their room and started watching TV. I was completely surrounded by about 14 dolls on little stands, all looking towards the bed. I don't know why they had them facing that way. It was really creepy. I got up and turned them around so they weren't facing me. After some time, I fell asleep watching TV. When I woke up, all the dolls were looking at me. I never went back in their room again after that. When I was a kid, my parents moved our family in with our grandparents because we were struggling and poor. Our room was at the back of the house, just across the hall from our grandparents, and since we were so small, we shared a queen-sized bed. We had this huge metal wardrobe in the room. It belonged to my grandma, but I think we kept our toys in it. A piece of wood held the doors shut when it wasn't in use, since it was old and didn't have a latch. Anyway, after a while, we started to hear very loud, frantic banging coming from inside it. I don't remember when it started, but I remember waking up one night and being terrified because it was so loud and so close. I remember staying up some nights, just listening to it, and a few times I'd look over and my brother would just be looking at me. We'd stare at each other in silence, both scared but afraid to say anything or move. Sometimes it even seemed like the wardrobe would shake from the force of whatever was inside it. My mother doesn't remember us telling her about the banging, but when I brought it up, she told me that she remembers both of us were terrified of the wardrobe and wouldn't go near it after a while. It was moved into the basement when we moved out of that room. What's really odd is that even though my brother and I both heard the banging, none of the adults ever did. The door was always left open since we were so young at the time, and nobody ever came in to see if something was wrong. It was like they couldn't hear it. One night, when we were a little older, I remember sitting up with my brother in that room, wide awake, even though it was well into the night. We were talking quietly in the dark, while the house creaked around us. I remember him looking up at the ceiling and saying, "You know when the house creaks and cracks at night, and they say it's just the house settling? They're lying. It's something else. The house is already settled. There's something else here making noises." As a child, I once woke up in the middle of the night on the other side of my room out of bed. The light was off in the hallway. I always kept it on, so I stepped out, flicked it on, and went back to bed wondering what had happened. Later that night, I woke up again even further from my bed, this time in the middle of the hallway that had the light switch. The lights were off again. I stood up and heard a creepy, sing-song voice. "Turn on the lights. Turn on the lights." It was coming from downstairs, the stairs being at the opposite end of the hallway from my room. I slowly went to the stairs and peeked down into the pitch-black darkness. Then it spoke again. "Turn on the lights so you can see me." I noped out of there and ran to my bed and waited a while. I could clear as day hear my front door open and shut, along with what sounded like 2 pairs of footsteps. I eventually waited for the noises downstairs to quit, and sprinted down the hall past the stairs and into my parents' room. My dad went downstairs and came back up, saying it was nothing, and put me back into bed. I spent the rest of the night awake, waiting for them to come back. When I was a kid, around 6 years old, I lived in a very arid area, and a wide field of red dirt was between my house and my bud's. Every day while walking over there, when I got about halfway across, I'd pick up a dirt clod or a small rock and toss it behind me over my shoulder. About 10 seconds later, it would come flying back over my head and land in front of me. I would just grin and keep walking. I remember this really distinctly, even trying to replicate it later in childhood after I'd moved away, and being sad that it didn't work anymore. I didn't question it as a kid, but looking back, it was really weird. When I was younger, maybe like 5, I went to bed and woke up to the sound of something whispering. I thought nothing of it until I heard it say, "Hey, psst." And I looked up and saw a black dog with yellow eyes standing on 2 legs. I started screaming and crying and yelled for my parents, and when they came up, the thing hid behind a chair in my room. I was so scared I slept with my parents for a week and never saw that thing again. I did have multiple dreams about it, though. It always had this power that it could make me freeze and not able to move. And he would always do it in front of my parents, and they never did anything.